there's a couple of you out there, so I want to say hello. I am talking to you today from my home on Bowen Island, and so it's always nice to kind of be able to do this from my office. So we're together for a little chunk of time here. Just like Kevin said, please feel free to send your questions. We'll leave some time for that at the end. And I'm also just going to start with my kind of home-based slide here because I'll post all of these slides on my website blog somewhere. All of my handouts are organized by date, so I'll make sure those are posted right by the end. Okay, let's do this. So if you watched the video that was posted, it was about diversity and inclusion. And so I was trying to think like what I could present for a little kind of half-hour chunk of time. And what's really been coming up for me, because I'm doing some research right now on my second book, and I'm realizing that the more that I dig into this, and I knew this already, but it's just another reminder about how much my understanding of inclusion just keeps changing, and what it was 5 years ago, 4 years ago, and what it was last week has now evolved again. And so I thought I would kind of take you through the journey of how my understanding has changed and how our understanding of inclusion has changed in British Columbia, especially with the renewed and the redesigned curriculum. So I thought I would just kind of take you through that journey and kind of give you an update of what my newest revelation about inclusion is. So if you have seen me present before, which I'm sure most of you have, you know that I kind of like to start with, there we go. Start with this question about, okay, what are we actually talking about when we talk about inclusion? I think philosophically we all understand this. We all agree that inclusion is for everyone, but depending on where you are, inclusion can look different. And so I like to kind of start with this slide. You can find this all over Google. There's many iterations of this slide. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I know that you've seen this before, but the big idea that I took from this when I first started to understand inclusion was my first misunderstanding about it was that we just put kids together, just put them together, which I've learned over time that's not inclusion at all, that's integration, where kids are physically together. We could probably think of times in our own life where we have been voluntold to do something or we have to physically be together, and that's the only criteria, and that's not enough for us, it's not enough for kids. And so just really quickly, how I kind of think about all of these bubbles is the bottom three here. That's about forced movement. So exclusion is forced separation by individual. Segregation is forced separation by group. Integration is the opposite of those. It's forced togetherness. Not enough. It's not enough. And so my first understanding of inclusion was really making the differentiation between a container that holds people to a community where people belong. And the reason why that's hard to do is because, you can force people together in a part all you want, but you can't force belonging. You can't force community. You have to build community. And so that was my first evolution of, okay, inclusion is how do we build community with our kids? And if you have been following along the Shelley Moore adventures, you know that I have a really nice PhD procrastination project called 5 More Minutes, and this is my YouTube channel. And my very, very first video was about how my understanding of inclusion evolved again to be a timeline. I was teaching a course at UBC, and my colleague Bruce Bairstow, who we all probably know very well, he was like, Shelley, I don't know if that's the right kind of representation of those dots. And I kind of always joke, I've never gone to a school that says they value segregation. It's never happened. But, sometimes kids will experience all 4 of these things depending on the day and sometimes at the same time. And so Bruce kind of brought up to me, he's just like, what if it's not, how these concepts are different from each other, but instead how they affect each other over time. And once we kind of started talking about that, you realize that these 4 concepts are actually a timeline. And you could look at this timeline through the lens of any marginalized population, which is what we talk about in the video. So if we look at this from the disabilities perspective, we could look at this from the perspective of people of color, indigenous populations. It wasn't so long ago that this was the history of women, and, still very much is the case around the world. So, you kind of realize that, we're slowly kind of committing to getting better at this over time. But then I have to kind of tell you what happened next, because I showed this slide to my a group of students that I was working with at UBC, and they were all practicing teachers. And so they're doing grad school. And so one of my students, her name is Julie, she looked at this and she was like, I hate this slide. And, I'm thinking to myself, I love this slide because, like, this causes such great conversation, especially this one here, especially this slide. Oops, not this one. This one, right? Like, to show this with colleagues, with parents, and be like, what are we actually talking about here? But Julie, she's like, nope, I hate this slide. I don't think any of these are inclusion. And I was like, what do you mean? And what she said, I'll never forget, because it helped me change my understanding of inclusion again, because she said, I don't think any of these concepts are inclusion, because what I see when I look at this is I see a whole bunch of green dots, and then I see like a handful of other colored dots. And she goes, over time, all we're trying to figure out how to do is what do we do with these other different people? And she goes, yeah, sure, I'll include a couple people who are different in my classroom. She's like, but in actuality, what happens is, red kids are attached to red teacher, and blue kids are attached to blue teachers, and yellow kids are attached to yellow teachers. And yeah, sure, we'll say we'll include them, but really at the end of the day, the goal is to make them green. And she goes, like, that's the special education model. And I was like, wow, okay, so you can pass and maybe also teach this course. But it caused this like huge conversation with my students to say, that's so true. Like, special education, it evolved out of the medical model, which is you go to the doctor when something's wrong. And the same thing with special education. You go to a special education teacher or a reading remediation teacher or a behavior support teacher when something's wrong, and the goal is to fix you. And we were all kind of talking about this, and we're like, well, that's not really the goal of our kids. Like, what if some kids aren't broken? What if they don't need to be fixed? And so this caused like a whole bunch of conversation. And so we were kind of throwing around ideas. Well, what could it be? What could the visual be that we're trying to show what inclusion is? And so we kind of came down to this. And the problem with all of these diagrams is that we have othered another group of people. There's this assumption that there's these green normal people, and we're trying to figure out what to do with these other non-green, not normal people. And that is really problematic in a lot of ways. And, if you look around the world, as soon as you other a group of people, they're different, they're scary, they need something else. And that has caused so much tension in the world. I mean, even if you just look at our election last week in Canada, like, it just was a whole bunch of groups othering each other. And so she's like, Julie, she goes, the only way that we can stop othering is if we start to actually acknowledge that all of our kids are actually another. Like, we're all another. And if you look at this diagram, this looks like classrooms today. Like, there's no more those other kids or those kids or your kids or my kids. There's just kids. And, if I think about what we're trying to create in our classrooms and have kids navigate things that they're going to have to navigate in the world, like, this is what the world looks like. And, if, one day I hope to be a parent, and that's exactly what I want my kid to get out of school, is how to navigate difference. Now, it's important to know that there's still a green dot here, okay, because it's important to recognize that there is still a skill in knowing when to be green. And what this green represents to me is really like this idea of compliance and kind of standardization. If you think about historically education, the goal was for students to be the same. It was to order homogeneity because it came out of the Industrial Revolution, and that's what we needed. We needed workers to be the same. And so, like, in today's society, what that green really represents is, I always think about the concept of should, like what should a student do? How should a grade 10 student behave, or what should they know, or how should a grade 4 student read? And, and so very, very often we use that concept of average or should to compare all of your kids to. And if you've read Todd Rose, The End of Average, you know that averaging in education is very problematic for many reasons. But one of them is when we actually teach or plan to the green, we're not actually planning for our kids, we're planning for all of the kids that ever existed. And when we start comparing kids to an average, unless we're actually comparing groups to each other, we're actually designing for mythical people. So one assumption that I'm really advocating for is, how do we actually teach to the diversity of our students rather than trying to make all of our students green? Because if that was the goal, as a teacher, I would look at this slide and think to myself, oh my goodness, that workload is so high. Because to me, as a special educator in that green thinking model, I think to myself, well, the goal is I have to make all of these dots green. That's a lot of individual education plans. Like, we've been trained to think about this in terms of this kind of historical retrofit standardized model, but specifically in BC, that's just not the goal anymore. We don't have to make everybody green. We don't have to fix people. And so when I kind of think about this myself, I'm like, okay. What if the goal was this? Like, what if we were moving away from education as being, how do we include kids who are different, to how do we actually teach to the difference of our classroom? How do we teach to the diversity? And when you look at it that way, you see this is no longer about disability anymore. This is about all of the things that make us unique, which is what we were talking about in the video, was that diversity is not just about disability. Diversity is about gender and culture and language and sexuality and all of the things that make us who we are. But yet very often we still put disability in this different category because they need something different. And as soon as we do that, we become an otherer again. And that's what we're trying to move away from. But then I have to tell you, so I was like totally feeling good about my new understanding of inclusion. Look, I've evolved. Teaching to diversity. Okay, let's do it. But also understanding that this can't be more work. Teachers we don't have time for more things. This has to be different. This has to be not just effective, because we know it's effective. Research says inclusion is effective, but it also has to be efficient, because we don't have more room on our plate. And so I've kind of really committed to this idea of how do we teach to diversity in a way that's not more work, but is different work. And a lot of people will push back on that, but I really, really believe it. Like, this can't be more work, or no one's gonna do it. So I'm feeling pretty good about this. I'm like, okay, so this is our new goal. But then I'm gonna show you. I made this video on the YouTube channel. I'm not gonna play it, but I'll just show you where you can get it. If you go to the 5 more minutes video, the very first video that I ever played was, I had it all here and now it's gone. This one here, the evolution of inclusion. So I won't play it, but in this video, at the very end of the video, oh, that's an ad. At the very end of the video, I ask the internet a question. And the question is, what do you think the next evolution of inclusion is? Now, that was designed to be rhetorical, but nothing's rhetorical in the land of the internet. And so I received a whole bunch of emails from people, and they were giving me their own versions of inclusion. So I'm going to share with you a couple because they're pretty good. So the first email I got was from a mom, and she said, Shelley, I know what the next evolution is, because when I look at this diagram, I see that all of the dots are the same size. She's like, people are not the same size. Size matters. Now, she was coming from the perspective, she goes, my son is a little person. One of those dots should be smaller. And I just kept thinking to myself, like, oh, of course, absolutely. Like, you're 100% right. Like, those should all be different sizes of dots. And then another person was like, okay, but Shelley, all of these diagrams have this dark black line around them. And he goes, what about virtual communities? What about, communities outside of a classroom, or, the school, or the community, or like being inclusive on the land? And I was like, oh, that's so true. And so he suggested that it's a dotted line. And I'm like, absolutely, that's a great suggestion. And then they just kept coming. So another person was like, Shelley, you are only representing one community here. If you only feel like you belong in one community, that's not inclusion. That's usually a default. Like, that's not enough. And he goes, you should have at least 4 bubbles of inclusion. And all I kept thinking was, my slide's not that big. So in honor of the feedback, here is other iterations of inclusion. So here's our little dot. Here's the dotted line of place-based loved, and here's the quad inclusion model. And then even just this Saturday, someone's just like, no, these should overlap like a Venn diagram. And I'm like, I can't keep up with this. So then now I'm like, okay, so now we're starting to like split. And I was in Grand Forks, shout out to Grand Forks. And I'm sitting there in the auditorium. And while I'm presenting, someone yells at me, Shelley, no, none of these are right. And he goes, I can't commit to a color. I'm like, I'm quitting, that's it. He's like, where's the intersectionality? I'm like, I can't do this job anymore. I can't keep up. But then I started really thinking about this, because what if all of us were little Trivial Pursuit pies? It's so weird to do this because I can't hear any of you, so I feel like I'm just laughing at myself. But now imagine little Trivial Pursuit pies. All of these little pies represent who we are, and we're different sizes and we're different colors. But then I was like, what do all of these colors represent? Which led me down a very big wormhole. So on Google Images, I find this. It's called the diversity wheel. And I was like, oh, this is perfect. So if you look at this wheel, it even looks like a Trivial Pursuit pie, which I recently found out is Canadian, I'll have you know. So we have all of these different colors. And I bet right now, if you look at this, you're going to look at this and say, okay, so which colors am I? And you're going to choose colors that represent things that are important to you, right? Like, if I were to think about myself today, you know, there's a whole combination of all of these. If I were to go back in time and tell my 13-year-old self that, like, I would have a really bright political color, I wouldn't have even believed me. But I've got a really bright political color, in the same way that I have a really bright, like, ability color and a cultural color, and all of these things that make up what we are. But this is the part that's important, is when you look at this and build your composition, I bet none of you picked out the things that you're not, right? And the reason why this is important is because I realized this, is where our colors come together. Like, say, for example, you find someone in your life who has a similar religion as you. That's where your colors are bright and you're drawn to each other. It's like, hey, you're my bright color, let's hang out. Like, this happens all the time. One teacher was telling me a story about a new arrival, little guy, little refugee arriving to Canada, doesn't have a lot of English. And he's on the playground and it's recess time and he's a little overwhelmed. And so she goes up to talk to him and she sees his face and he's terrified. But then immediately his face changes because he hears someone else on the playground speaking his language. Like, what happened to these kids? They were like magnets because they realized that they share a color with each other. Now, there's a huge misunderstanding that inclusion is trying to eliminate those communities. Those communities can still be inclusive because they're communities of choice and identity. And all of us still need these things. What inclusion is also advocating for, though, is what if we are in a community with someone where we have different colors that are both bright? So, for example, if Kevin is blue and I am orange, no connection to the Oilers, who I love at all, but me and Kevin are going to hang out, and you know what? I'm going to learn from his orangeness, and he's going to learn from my blueness. That's a community of diversity. But then I started thinking, that's not what happens in school. This is what happens in school. We often organize kids by what they're missing, not by what they have or what they are or what they bring. So we'll say, all of the kids who can't read, go over there. All of the kids who can't behave, go over there. My favorite one is, all the kids who can't speak English, go over there and speak English. Like, it's actually the opposite of how we learn. Like, if we want to speak English, we need to be around people who have bright colors in speaking English. If we want to learn how to read better, we need to be around people who have bright colors in reading, because that's how we learn from difference. But the other thing that we do is, if we are in a community of diversity, our goal isn't always to learn from each other. Sometimes we think our goal is, I'm blue and Kevin's orange, and my job is to make him blue and his job is to make me orange. We're not actually learning from each other at all. We're trying to change each other. And that's not inclusion, my friends. That's assimilation. And that has no place in Canada. But then I'm thinking about our election, and that's all that happened. So here is my thinking. What if inclusion was this? What if the goal of inclusion is we are teaching to diversity, but we're also helping kids to find ways that they connect with each other through their identity. We're also helping kids to figure out how do we learn from other people who are different than us or who have a different identity than us, but in a way that's not trying to change them. If there was one skill the whole world could learn right now, that is it. Is how do we learn from difference? How do we hang out with people who are different than us, but also learn from them as opposed to trying to change them? I don't know. Let me tell you, this is all I talked about at Thanksgiving dinner. Okay, so here is my most recent up-to-date understanding of inclusion. Because the more you think about this, the more you think about, okay, well, do kids even know their identities? You know, because you realize often that sometimes identities aren't even necessarily safe to declare. So here's my most recent, as of last week, up-to-date version of what inclusion is, because I think that this is going to help us. So here we go. So my first understanding of inclusion is this: how do we include kids who are different? And namely, those kids who are different often have disabilities. But then I started to change and say, okay, well, wait a second. What if inclusion meant that we're not just teaching to kids with disabilities, we're teaching to how all of the kids are different. We're teaching to the diversity. But now as I'm really sinking in on this and understanding, well, if kids don't even know who they are or what their identities are, or if they're not even safe to declare them, then we can't even teach them that diversity because they don't even know how they're diverse. And so now, this is what I think it is. Inclusion is not just teaching to diversity, it's also teaching to student identity, because we have to help kids to know who they are so that we can respond to them. And the more that I do this work, I realize that the real only identity that is really safe to declare in schools is if you're a dead white man. And so we need to really think about this in terms of are kids actually in a safe place to declare who they are? Because I don't think a lot of kids do feel safe. And when I say that, I mean, if you look at our kind of the populations that we're really trying to support in, especially in British Columbia, are kids who are Indigenous, are kids with disabilities, are kids who are queer, are kids who are struggling with mental health. And if you think about, you know, what they need to feel safe and inclusive in schools, and they need to feel belonging, they need to start seeing themselves in their curriculum in a way that they can start to look up and say, hey, that's like me. But if I think back to my own experience, we were lucky to even learn about a woman. So to like have someone in my curriculum that may have been positive and queer, for example, could have completely changed. I mean, in grade 11, we read Fried Green Tomatoes, and it didn't even come up once why Ruth and Iggy were living together in the Whistle Stop Cafe. That conversation could have made the world of difference for me. So this is going to be my last thing that I'm going to say to you, because I'm learning the most about this. And if you've been in my sessions in the last few weeks, you'll see that this has been a profound impact on me. The number one thing we can do to respond to our kids and how we can teach diversity is to look at our curriculum, look at our examples, look at our texts, look at our content and say, does it look like my kids? Are the books we're reading, do they look like my kids? If you have a kid with autism, Greta Thunberg needs to be in all of your classrooms, because I think this is the first thing we can do to start really including our kids and teaching for diversity, is helping them to say, hey, that's like me. I have autism, and that's okay. Hey, that's like me. I'm queer. Hey, I'm proud of that. And I think that's a different experience than I know I had in school, and I think a lot of kids had in school. So this is my most up to date. This is going to go on the internet in a year from now. I'm going to be like, no, there's more. I'm learning more, which I think is just the perfect example of inclusion, is that it keeps evolving because we keep learning more about it. So I encourage you to keep digging in, because inclusion is absolutely a journey, not a destination. So my friends, here's my last slide. This is where you can get a hold of me. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, if you want to see pictures of my puppy. 5moreminutes.com is my procrastination project, where you can find YouTube videos and podcasts. And blogsomewhere.com is where I will put the handouts from this very short and fast 27-minute presentation. And now we will open it up to questions. Thanks, Kevin.
All right. Thank you so much, Shelley. And I appreciate you including me in
Oh,
your
totally.
example as well. So, uh, Shelley, just so much there to think about. For me, so a question for you, and I encourage our participants to put questions in the question box as well, and I'll pitch them to Shelley. So, um, you're at the beginning of your career. I'm sort of at the end of mine.
Hmm.
And I'm curious about, and I sort of relate this to my own children who are in their early 20s, and they just do things so much better than I do. They don't see gender or
Hmm.
sexuality or race or ability.
Hmm.
But I think for those sort of people who are experienced, I'll use that word for myself,
Yeah.
we're stuck in that model of um, this is how I help. This is turning everyone into green dots, for lack of a better
Hmm.
example. For so someone, where's a starting place for those of
Hmm.
us who are sort of slowly moving along that inclusion
Hmm.
timeline?
Yeah. I think the thing is there's always going to be a reason why you can't be inclusive. There's always going to be one. But I think what's really unique about BC is that we're kind of running out of those reasons. Like, even at the top infrastructural levels of government, there's decisions that are being made to reduce barriers for diversity, whether that's around learning or whether that's around equity. And so I think for people who have been around for a long time, I kind of feel for you. I mean, Kevin, you learned the game
You
and now the
too.
game is changing, you know? And so I think that if there was a piece of advice I would give to people who have been in their careers for a long time, is that, I know that change is hard. I know that change is hard. But here's the thing is that I'm realizing more and more that once you see these things, you can't unsee them.
Mhm,
And you actually realize that it's so much better. it's
mhm,
it's so much better than what we've done. You're going to see kids be successful that have never been successful. And anyone I know who's in education, they didn't go into education for the paycheck. They didn't go into education for the holidays. They went into education because they really believe and they love kids. And you know, there's never a teacher that I've talked to that doesn't understand that piece of those teachable moments when you see a kid succeed. And what I've really realized is that the more we shift to responding to diversity, the more moments like that you're going to get.
mhm.
And I can appreciate that the game is changing for sure, but I think part of it is looking for the ways that we can move as opposed to looking for the reasons why we can't, because I think it's just in the long run preventing people from seeing what's possible.
Right.
And
So,
I'm a very big believer of baby steps. I'm a very big believer of don't do everything, do one thing, start somewhere, connect with people around you, because I think one thing we're very fortunate about in British Columbia is to be surrounded by people who believe in this stuff. And so if you're feeling frustrated and you don't know what to do, go talk to your people, find some people around you, because I can guarantee you every single school in this province has people who are doing phenomenal things around inclusion and diversity.
I completely agree.
Mm-hmm.
So, what for you? What's the measuring stick in terms of us moving forward along this timeline? Are there certain indicators out there that you're monitoring to say, okay, we're advancing, we're evolving as in terms
Mm-hmm.
of the sector, and starting to make tangible differences for in terms of moving toward
Yeah.
more inclusive
That's such a good
system?
question. That's such a good question. A lot of people use data, right? I'm not a super quantitative person. I'm much more into the stories. I don't know if you've picked up on that yet, Kevin, but but I think I really started to notice why BC is different once I actually started to leave BC, because the stories I hear in British Columbia are different than the stories I hear everywhere else. And so one huge indicator for me that kind of communicates where we are on this evolution is the conversations that I have in BC aren't about philosophy. Like, there's very few people that I actually am trying to change their mind in BC. Teachers understand why this is important. Educators know why this is important. The question that really happens in BC is how do we do it? And how do we do it so that it's not too overwhelming and too much of a workload for teachers, because teachers work so hard. There's no room for more. And we talked about that, right? But in many other places that I go, the questions aren't around the how, the questions are around the why. And so that's a huge indicator for me. Now, that being said, we still have a long ways to go. Another indicator for me is in terms of the actual age that's included. So in BC, for example, I am doing many groups with schools around secondary inclusion and high school inclusion. And I'm doing a couple of those projects around the world, but usually the efforts are on kind of primary elementary. So that's another indicator I look for is, are we looking at inclusion from across the educational lifespan? Another indicator I think is really critical is stories from parents and from self-advocates. Like, what has their journey of schooling been? What does it mean to them? What does it look like? Do people feel heard? So I mean, I'm very fortunate to be in the position I'm in to hear a lot of these stories, and they're not all perfect. I'm not gonna be naive to that, but I think that the more that they learn about BC, the more I realized that our conditions are different than anywhere else. Like, a lot of the reasons why people can't be inclusive, we don't have those restrictions. We're not standardized anymore, for example. We don't have standardized exams. Our curriculum has completely shifted to be conceptual. Like, every single kid can be successful. And so it really is a matter of, how do we support teachers and how do we support schools to be able to do this in ways that are efficient, because efficiency is important. But yeah, I think that big answer to that question is the stories,
Mhm.
or the stories I hear.
I think you're raising a really good point when it comes to parents, and I've seen, over the course of my career, certainly a significant shift in parents' attitudes towards that. But as an experienced principal, and I'm generalizing and paraphrasing, I would sometimes hear from parents that I want my kids to have the same educational experience that I had when I hated school back then.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, and it's true. And I think, like, parents are a really key stakeholder in this whole education movement. And I kind of feel for them sometimes because, as an educator, we know that the paradigm is shifting, but not all the parents know that the paradigm is shifting. Let's really make sure that we keep them in our bubble in terms of how curriculum is shifting and how assessment is shifting, and to really make sure that they're aware that kids' needs are still being met. And even though it looks different, sometimes I'll kind of bring up the example of, would you go to a medical doctor that's been doing the same practice for 50 years, or would you go to a medical doctor who's up to date on the most recent research? And I think sometimes we forget that still applies to education. Like, we're learning more about education and how kids learn, and so really making sure that we keep parents in on that conversation so that they're not left out and wondering what's going on, because the game is changing,
Absolutely.
and
So,
helping them
Shelley,
know what to advocate for.
I
Mm-hmm.
can't thank you enough for giving up your time today and your important messages. I feel like we're really just scratching the surface of this, and
Mm-hmm.
I know that you have much more to share, and we're all very interested in your learning journey and sharing
Oh,
your learning journey as it
it's exhausting.
evolves. So thank you so much for your
Thank you,
time today.
Kevin.
I really appreciate it, Shelley. I'm just noticing just one question in the chat
Okay.
box from Tammy, of course.
Hi, Tammy.
Uh, Love the way you learn out loud with us, and I think that's just a great way for us to end our time together. So
That's
thank you again,
perfect.
Shelley. Much appreciated.
Thanks so much.